Haley, can you even believe that we are already at the end of June? I can't even. Summer, where have you gone?
I know. It's actually crazy. I feel like this month went by so fast.
Yeah, it just keeps, that's just life. I feel like
Yeah.
especially as you get older.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
As
so
a
true.
kid, think like summer was forever.
Yeah.
And then you get older and, time just flies by. Okay, what are we talking about today?
So today we are talking about questions you're afraid to ask out loud.
Oh, right up my alley. That's we for cross communication, we just did our initiative for 2025 is about
Yeah.
teaching people the power of questions and
Yeah.
how important that is. So I'm super excited about today's episode. I love how hard some of the submission questions that we've been getting
Mm,
are. And I love that people haven't shied away from asking the tough questions. I'm actually going through not the Talmud, but writings about, because it's, you can't really study the Talmud without being in partnership and with a rabbi at a synagogue. But
yeah.
I'm reading books about how to understand the Talmud and its writings and stories. And a lot of it that I've learned so far is how important, like, dialogue is in the Jewish culture and asking difficult questions and not really focusing on
Mm,
answers, which is exactly what we do with this podcast. So it was just really incredible to me as I'm learning all of this, that the focus is like engaging in debate and dialogue and seeing that there's so many different ways to view a law or a text or an ethic, and seeing what all the different rabbis in history have said about this particular verse. So I love that we are not shying away, just like the Jews didn't shy away. And that's so part of the culture that Jesus would have grown up in. I think, you know how I feel about this, but I feel like Christians have shied away a little bit. And I
yeah.
think we get, I don't know, just really arrogant about being certain that we have the right answers. And that is, I don't know if it's my background in academia that makes me really like flabbergasted by that,
Hmm.
because by the time you get a PhD, all you start to realize is how much you don't know.
Mm,
Because I
yeah.
read a new article, I read a new book, and
Yeah.
I'm like, I've never heard that. You know what I mean? Like I'm
Yes.
learning a
Yeah.
new concept now. So I just want to caution people. I know we're going to get to group chat, but I just want to caution people. Whenever you think you know all there is to know, it is probably because of how little you know. I would
Mm,
say that that's a really big indicator that you know very
yeah.
little, because the more you learn, the more you realize, oh my goodness, there's just so much to digest and explore, and so many different ways that people throughout history have seen whatever particular issue. So I'm just loving this theology series. Okay. I know the people, I know somebody is sitting there right now saying, Heather, tell us about the group chat. What is happening with the group chat? And so we did something different today. I don't know if we've done this before, but I sent you a DM on IG, Haley, and I
Yeah.
saw this on Threads, and I was like, "Oh, let's just read it to the group chat." I don't know how many answers we're going to give, but I just thought it was such an interesting post, and I
Yeah.
wanted people to just chew on it for a second. But remember, if you want to send your submissions, we do also do submissions. This one's just going to be a post I saw online. If you want us to go through your submission at the group chat, you can just send it to Haley at whatifimwrongpod@gmail.com. Whatifimwrongpod@gmail.com. You can send her a voice memo or a written submission. And with these submissions, we are just looking at for the group chat different real life relational dynamics that you may need the help of the group chat to process. So here we go. Are you guys ready? Here we go. The moment you've been waiting for. Let's enter the group chat.
Okay. Here is what we saw on Threads. A new girl I'm developing a friendship with invited me to her birthday dinner. I say, thanks for the invite, but I've never had good experiences with those, so I'll have to kindly decline. However, we can make plans with just you and me if you would like. She said she just wanted me there to celebrate with her on her special day. I could tell she was upset about it. This is a boundary that I'm not willing to compromise on. Am I a bad friend for saying I don't want to?
Okay,
So
wait,
that is
Haley,
the
there's
original.
yeah. That was the post. Tell them some of
Yeah,
a couple of the or I don't know how many you have, but one of the
yeah,
responses, because I think I sent you one that I was like,
yes, yes, you did.
yeah, this is probably where I land. So go ahead, Haley.
Yes, so here's the response. You're not a bad friend, but perhaps an exhausting one. If I invited someone out and they turned it into an opportunity to talk about their boundaries, I'd be so annoyed. Like, bro, just say you can't make it. Everything isn't a think piece.
This is what it's like, you are absolutely entitled to say, "Oh, I get anxiety or whatever. I get uncomfortable."
Yeah.
I've had bad experiences with birthday parties. You're entitled to have those feelings. I do think that we are becoming, not all of us, right? Of course, I don't want to use too expansive of language, but I think internet culture has made us like a little bit awkward, where everything
Mm,
becomes a soapbox. Everything is about my values. Everything's
yeah.
about my boundaries. It's like, babe, you don't have to go, just don't go to the party.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, I agreed with that response. Like, this doesn't have to become a think piece. You don't have to write an article. Just say, I don't want to go. Like, yeah, hey, I'm busy that day. Here's what I'm saying. I just think we have to be very careful about making everything about us.
Yeah.
Your friend is having a birthday. I don't know how old these people are. This was a viral thread, by the way. So there was tons of different comments. A lot
Yeah.
of them, I think, under the same sentiment as I share. Haley, I'll get your opinion on it. Maybe you're more empathetic than I was when I read it. But I don't know how old these people were, but I know how difficult it would be for me at 38 to throw a birthday party for myself. Like, that's just not something I would do. So if you are like, you know what, this is the year I'm going to throw a birthday party for myself, I think that's awesome. And then you're like inviting people. That's awesome. And then somebody's like, actually, the ethical implications of birthday parties, I'm just not, you know what I mean? It's like, just, eat some cake. Show up for 50. It's not about you. Show up for
Yeah.
15 minutes and eat a piece of cake and go home. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know, Haley. What do you think?
I think that there is definitely an element to where it's becoming about her. Like, I
Yes!
definitely see that. But I also think, like, if her friend is so upset about it, then maybe she doesn't have to make it this whole, like, boundary situation, but she could just say, like, hey, I actually, like, went to this birthday party and this is what happened and that's why I don't want to go. Like, she's just kind of being weird about it, of like,
Right.
this is my boundary, I'm not going. I don't know. I just think, like, if it's really that big of a deal that you don't want to go, maybe just, like, explain, and maybe your friend will have more empathy for why you don't want to come to the birthday party.
Yeah, I don't want to, talk about this for 15 minutes, but I will say, is it possible that your friend had a bad experience where nobody showed up to their birthday party and now you're
Yeah.
triggered? It's like, come on.
Yeah.
We all have stuff,
Yeah.
So my advice, if this is you, and I hope I haven't offended you, okay? If this is you and you're like, hey, I've had these bad experiences, friend, just don't go. Or show up for 15, 20 minutes and say, oh, I have to go to this other thing, but I just wanted you to know, like, I see you and I'm here and I brought you this gift. I just think that's the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take something about them and make it about you. So that would be my response. Thanks for entering the group chat with us. Okay, before we get to submissions, let's define the term. Remember, for this segment, I am going to tell you a word and its actual definition. And I want you to ask yourself how knowing the actual definition may change how you see your relationship with that word. Today's word is faith. Faith. So, according to the Oxford Dictionary, faith is defined as complete trust or confidence in someone or something. In a religious context, it's often described as strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. Now, here's the part that made me stop. Faith isn't certainty. And it's not about having every answer or never doubting. It's about trust. Even when the evidence isn't obvious, it's a relationship word, not a logic word. Faith is a relationship word, not a logic word. So, what if I've been wrong in thinking Faith means never asking questions. Our episode today, asking tough questions. What if I'm wrong? Thinking that my faith means I can't ask any questions or I can't doubt any of this. What if faith actually requires questions? Because trust that's never tested isn't really trust. Maybe faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the decision to stay even in the presence of it.
This is so good. And it made me think about what faith looked like for most people in scripture.
Mm,
And I think about Job and David and even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
mm.
They all questioned and wrestled and cried out, and yet they stayed in relationship. That's faith.
Yes. And I would also say if the righteous are called to live by faith, you are
Mm,
going to constantly find yourself in situations and circumstances in which trust is going to be required.
mm,
That's why it's so shocking when people are able to say, I'm not going to go based on what I see. I'm not going to go
yeah.
based on my circumstances. I believe and I trust that God will show up for me, that God is with me. Maybe that's the better word, that God is always with you, despite your circumstances, despite disappointments, despite what you see. God is with you. Okay, we're going to get into the tough questions, and who better to do that? I'm really, really, really like totally fangirling, super excited. Jared Byas. I cannot wait for you guys to hear what he has to say. I am super excited about today's episode and our guest for these submissions, Haley. First of all, loving what we're doing on these theology questions right after my own heart. But I have read several books by our guest here, Jared Byas. I've read almost, I think, all your books, actually. I did. Do you know that?
No.
All of
Well,
them,
thank you. I
brother.
feel honored. I feel honored.
Yeah, Love Matters More. Highly recommend. I'm a big fan of the Bible for Normal People podcast, but then Genesis for Normal People. I went through that as I was traveling, moving to Texas, listened to the whole thing. Jonah, fantastic book that you did on Jonah. So I'm so excited to introduce our people to you if they're not familiar, or just confirm for them how awesome you are. So thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Actually, before we even get into like our questions today, can you just explain a little bit about your premise for Love Matters More? Because I read that book, I sent it to my husband, and then I have a ministry partner that wanted to read. It's like required reading, I think. Really important, especially for a time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Especially for a time right now where it seems like love and compassion and empathy are becoming debatable Christian values. Can you
hmm
walk us through what made you want to write that book?
Yeah. I mean, I think the subtitle is important. How fighting to be right keeps us from loving like Jesus. And
Mm,
I mean, for me, it comes out of my own personal experience of being in a Christian tradition where getting things right was always privileged. So, because I was smart, because I understood theology and read nerdy books, I was sort of ushered to the front of the line. I was given leadership positions. I was asked to be in charge of things. But then when I read the biblical text, that doesn't seem to be one of the virtues. Being smart,
mm,
knowing a lot of things, having the right beliefs, being correct about ideas about God. But it was about love, and that
mm,
became very convicting for me. And so I actually wanted to write a book about truth. And it turns out that if you are rooted in the Christian tradition and in the biblical text, you can't really talk about truth without talking about love. So
mm,
that's
mm.
sort of I sort of had to change course in my research and say this is actually a book about love is what this is about.
How do you respond? Because I'm absolutely sure that this happens to you, that people say, well, he's just trying to water down the gospel. He just doesn't, he's just not letting people pursue holiness and righteousness or whatever. How do you respond to that criticism?
Um, I mean, I think it is it again for me. It would have been my own criticism had I confronted myself 20 years ago.
Mm, mm,
Um, that again, the idea that we have to just get it right is, I think, baked into a lot of our Christian traditions. That everything is about believing the right things. So if you say the right words, say the sinner's prayer, ask Jesus into your heart, you just have to believe the right things about God, sort of, then you're saved, or then you're a good Christian, or
Yeah.
whatever all that is. And so I just think, for me, as someone who went to school to study the Bible and was a pastor for a long time, I think for me, I would just say, let's just go back to the life and ministry of Jesus. What was Jesus about? And let's just talk about what we find in the biblical text, what we find in the life of Jesus. And if you can convince me that getting things right seem to be the most important thing to Jesus, then maybe I can be convinced. But the more I study the text, it seems to be about our character, our life, and how it's modeled after the love that Jesus showed in his ministry and his work, and that trajectory we see throughout the biblical text. So I would just say, like, we have to go back to, what do we agree on? And I think as Christians, we agree that Jesus is the center of our faith. And so
Yeah.
what do we see in that, in the life and ministry of Jesus, and Jesus' own words that says it's by the fruits that you will know people. It's
Yeah.
by how we are interacting. You'll you'll know by my disciples by the way that you follow in my footsteps, by the ways you follow my commands, which is love one another.
Yeah. Which, so all of this is actually the perfect premise to start our submissions today, right? So we're going to give some advice, some feedback, some answers, but remembering that the most important thing is that we learn to love one another, even if we disagree with each other's perceptions or ideas of how this is supposed to go. So, Haley, what do we got for submission number 1? First of all, how were they this time?
They're good. They're
Okay.
definitely, they're deep, but they're really good.
Okay, let's hear the first one.
Yeah. All right. Why would a loving God allow such suffering in the world? Why would genocide be tolerated? And why wouldn't God stop such events?
Yeah, well, we're not going to resolve this today, because this is actually, this is
like the number one question people have, right? Why would a good God allow suffering?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's such an old conversation. I mean, this has been happening within the Christian tradition and within the Jewish tradition for centuries and centuries. So there's a famous book, I think in the 90s, by a rabbi, Harold Kushner, called Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People, that explores this idea. And it goes back, again, hundreds, thousands of years. We actually find it in our Bibles itself, right? When we find Psalm 73, I think, that sort of outlines, why do the wicked prosper? We see this in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Why is it that good people seem to have hardship and bad people seem to? How does God interact with the world when it comes to good and evil? And so, historically or traditionally, we paint this. We have sort of 3 points on the triangle that we're trying to reconcile. How can there be a God that's all powerful, also all loving, right, and all knowing? Like, how do you have a God who is all 3 of these things? And so I think theologians, more and more, I would just say, in the tradition that I'm a part of, you have to sort of figure out which one of these you're going to, which one of these points on the triangle you're going to adjust. Because it's very difficult. As you can imagine, we've been wrestling with this for 2,000 years. How do we, even longer, 2,500 years, how do we reconcile these 3 components, right? And so I appreciate more and more of the work of theologians like Tom Oord, who would say, well, let's think of it this way. What's the relationship of love to control? And can you be loving if you're controlling? And can you control if you're loving, right? And that gets complicated, right? This is a very complicated conversation and nuance. We could talk for hours and hours about this. But theologians like Tom Oord, who has a really good book called God Can't, that dives into this question a lot more, says, well, if God's very nature is love, and love by definition can't control, then maybe part of God's nature is to not intervene in these things, because that would be to control us. And so it's to wrestle with this relationship between love and control. And I think That is a lot of what it comes down to in this debate or in this conversation of why does God allow these atrocities and these things to happen? And Tom and others in this tradition would say maybe it's because at God's very core, God is loving. And by definition, love is not controlling, right? Where that would be different from a tradition I grew up in, like in the more conservative Presbyterian tradition, where we call it God's sovereignty, right? God's ability to control is actually the center thing. That
Yeah.
sort of defines God's essence is God is sovereign. God can do whatever God wants because God is all powerful. And so if that's your trajectory, if you think the essence of God is sovereignty or control, then you're going to answer that question around why does God allow these things to happen. It's going to take you in a different direction. You may say things like, I think it's Isaiah 55, God's ways are higher than ours. And so there's this idea of incomprehensibility. We don't understand. We just have to trust that at the end, it all works out for the good, right?
Right.
Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose, that kind of thing. So that becomes more of the answer to this question when you emphasize God's control over God's love. But if you emphasize God's love over God's control, you may end up with this idea again that God is cares. God is trying in non-coercive, that's a fancy way of saying, non-controlling ways to steer humanity and our environment in the world toward peace and love and non-destruction and non-harm. But God can't do that by God's very nature if it means controlling humans. So that maybe is a complicated way of talking about that question.
No, I think it's very helpful, but I want to ask you, because as much as I agree with the idea that it's not about right thinking. However, sometimes the way we think about who God is then changes the way I act. So, who is this? It's from the book God Changes the Brain. And it talks about how the God you believe in is the type of person you become. So when I believe that God is controlling, when I believe that God is going to get me if I mess this up, when I believe that God is angry or can't wait to burn a 17-year-old kid forever and ever, that change, I then become that type of Christian. But when I believe that God is love and joy and mercy and patience and peace, I then become a loving, joyful, merciful Christian. So my idea or my thinking about who God is does change the way I show up in the world. And so how do we wrestle through as Christians in a time where things are so difficult? Other people's thinking about God that then informs their actions and how they act in this world.
I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think you're right. To say that love matters more is not to say, and I go out of my way many times in the book to say that our beliefs do matter.
Yeah.
Right? They're just a means to an end. They are a tool for a greater purpose, right? And so we have to judge our beliefs based on the fruit that they are producing. Yeah. Are they producing loving actions and behaviors, right? And the only thing I would say is I think how we believe about God does affect and impacts how we show up in the world. But I wouldn't say it's determinative, because I've known people in my life that would be counterfactuals to that, right? Where they have a belief in things that I would think would lead to unloving and unkind. And yet some of the most loving, kind people in my life were people from a tradition I'm no longer a part of.
Yes.
Right? And so I have to be careful not to draw this one-to-one comparison. I think it impacts it. I think there's certainly, it's in the soup, right? It's one of the ingredients, but it's bigger than that as well. And I think some of that is recognizing within our traditions, we are born into certain beliefs and traditions that we grow up with that we don't even know that we've internalized. And some of that is going to be positive, and some of that's going to be negative. I always argue, my mom doesn't like me talking about this, but I always say she wasn't very, I grew up in a more fundamentalist evangelical tradition. And I say to her, like, Mom, I'm so grateful you weren't very good at it. Because that was kind of the explicit teaching, but in our home, she modeled more for me presence and love and kindness and not control and not coercion. she modeled a different
Mm.
way of behaving than maybe the God she had been given. And so all those signals get all mixed up sometimes in terms of how people turn out, right? So I think not necessarily for me, when you ask, what do we do in this world? I always want to start by trying to really understand where people are coming from. That's always my first step, is curiosity. I think it should be a core Christian virtue in these times we're living in, to be curious, and to ask questions about why is it that you're behaving this way? What fears are behind that? What concerns do you have? What beliefs are funneling or fueling how you're showing up in the world? And sometimes, or a lot of times, what I can hopefully in a loving way point out is the inconsistency of
Yeah.
the things that you're saying and the things that you're doing don't help me understand how those are supposed to be aligned. You may have a certain logic to it that you are walking down, but I don't understand it. So help me to understand that, so I can better be present to you, better love you, and not judge you. Like I just want to understand so that
Yeah.
I'm not judging you. I don't know if
It's
that answers your question, but
absolutely, and actually very convicting. I had somebody DM me yesterday. I had shared a quote by Pope Francis about
Mhm.
immigrants, and they jumped to something about, well, people just need to follow the laws. And I wanted to respond, and I really felt the Spirit say, just ask her a question. And
Mhm.
so I did. I asked a question about where this was coming from with her. Anyway, we ended up having a better conversation because of asking a question rather than assuming that I knew what she was trying to do or knew where she was coming from, which is why we have What If I'm Wrong? Right, Haley? That's the
Yeah,
point, is
exactly.
that are we willing to submit ourselves before the Lord and to say, what could I be getting wrong
Mhm.
about who you are and how you operate?
Yeah.
All right, let's do one more. We have like 5 minutes. Let's do one more.
Okay. Why does the Bible include all that stuff about slavery, stoning people to death, and basic human error? Why would such an important book be so open to interpretation?
Mm,
This is a great question. This is the heart of what we do at the Bible for All People,
yes.
right? So for 10 years, we've been asking two questions. What is the Bible? What do we do with it? Right.
Mm.
And so I think there's just some there. Again, we talked about this a minute ago. We have inherited a certain lens through which we see our faith. And that in the Protestant tradition, if you're not Roman Catholic, and maybe even if you are, the Bible is a very important piece of the puzzle, and how we see the Bible, right? So when we say, why would such an important book be so open to interpretation? I think sometimes there's an assumption of what we want the Bible to be or what we wished the Bible was. This inerrant rule book that tells us exactly how to live our life. And in some ways, there's an assumption in that I think is really important to understand. And that is, how can I manipulate God to give me blessings? Right? So
Mm.
in Christian tradition, we call that prosperity gospel, but I think a lot of us have it. I would guess most Christians were brought up with some idea that if I do A and B,
Yes.
God will make sure, God will protect me, right?
Mhm.
So if I follow the rules, good things will happen to me. And if I don't, bad things will happen to me. And so the only way I know I can follow the rules is if I know what the rules are and if the rules are clear. But if you go to the Bible and you actually read the Bible, you're going to recognize very quickly it's a terrible rule book. Most of it is like stories about ancient Israelites that don't have a lot to do culturally with the way we live our life now. So how is that supposed to be a rule book? So maybe the problem isn't with the Bible. Maybe it's with our framework and our expectations that we've put on the Bible, right? So, why does the Bible include all of that stuff about slavery, stoning people to death, and basic human error? It's because it is even if it is a thoroughly divine book, God inspired, it is also at the same time a thoroughly human book that has the marks of human culture because it was written at a particular place and a particular time by particular people who were wrestling with things like slavery, stoning people to death. Those were part of the culture and the practices of the day. So to think that the Bible is going to escape that, in my opinion, is an unrealistic expectation to have on the Bible. And it keeps us from seeing what truly the Bible is and what we can do with it as Christians and how we can engage with it in more faithful ways over time, rather than blindly following the lens or the interpretation that we've been given. How do we go back and say, to your point, what if I've been wrong about this?
Mm.
What am I missing about this context that helps me to respect what this Bible really is and what it can be used for in our faith expression and in our faith communities? So I think why does it include all that? Because it's a human book. And we have this parallel even in our Christian tradition of a Jesus, the center of our faith, who we say is both thoroughly divine and thoroughly human.
Yeah.
And in the same way, we should then expect the human marks on Jesus, who grew in wisdom, which meant he didn't know everything, right? Our Bible tells us that. So Jesus dies on a cross in a shame-filled way. These are very human, embarrassing things about Jesus. And yet that is the center of our faith. And so why would we expect our Bible to be anything other than that?
Mm. Jared, you are so good. I absolutely adore you. I love your ministry. I just pray all the blessings on you guys as you keep reaching people and explaining these concepts with such grace, which I think is super important, because it's not that there's not other people talking about it. I can genuinely say this. I think what you and Peter Enns do, it's unique in the fact that there's so much grace and love at the core of asking and wrestling through these questions, which is just a wonderful model. So highly recommend. The Bible for Normal People is their podcast. Love Matters More is, I think it's the first book I read of yours. And then Genesis for Normal People. And then he also has Jonah for Normal People. Jared, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
I want to close every episode with a segment I call Day in the Bible. And this is where I share something I have learned in Bible study with you that will beg the question, what if I'm wrong about how I have been reading or thinking or explaining this Bible passage? Today, we are going to look at Matthew 5 and the Sermon on the Mount, specifically thinking about the word blessing that is used in verses 3 through 10. So I'm going to read to you Matthew 5. We're going to go through verses 3 to 10. And then I want to talk for a little bit just about, what does this word blessing mean? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here is what I want you to think about today as we close out this episode and you go back to doing whatever it is you're going to do for the rest of the day. I just want this thought to be in the back of your mind. In general, when we think, or at least for me, when I've talked about blessing, I am often really talking about God's favor or God's protection or God's provision. But in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, the blessings often look nothing like comfort. Jesus opens the Sermon on the Mount with, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the persecuted. That doesn't sound like favor or resources or abundance or protection. It sounds like difficulty or pain or discouragement. So here's what I want you to think about. What if in the upside down kingdom of God, which remember is the kingdom that all of us are invited to start living in right now. It is not something that happens later. It's what God is inviting us to live in right now as Christians, as the Spirit of God dwells in you. In the upside down kingdom of God, what if what it means to be blessed changes? What if that's upside down too? What if a blessing isn't always the job or the house or the healing or the money or the resources? What if it's the nearness of God, even in the absence of those things? Maybe the greatest blessings aren't what we receive, but who we receive. What if God's presence is the blessing? What if God is with you right now, even if your circumstances don't reveal it, even in the hard questions? What if even right now, my friend, because God is with you, Christ in me? What if because God is with you right now, you're blessed? That's it for today's episode. Join us next week as we continue in our theme of theology. Remember, we extended our theme a week because I could not get enough.
Yes, next week we are talking about exploring different faith traditions. You can send me your submissions if you want us to discuss whatever experience you are questioning on the podcast. Email me at whatifimwrongpod@gmail.com.
I'm Heather Thompson Day, and I'll see you next week.